Hi, it's Len Edgerly here. Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles. Today is Friday, May 28th, 2021, coming to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts on a gray, rainy night. And my interview this week is, I think it's a first in all of the 12 years I've done the show, because Darlene, my wife, joined me for the interview. And that's because we were speaking with Paul Rudnick, author of Playing the Palace, that was released on the day of our interview, Tuesday, May 25th. And I had ended up reading the whole book to Darlene. I read her a little bit of it, and she just loved it. So over a few days, we had the experience of reading a book together. I think that was the first time we'd done it for a while. So I thought it'd be fun for her to sit in on the interview, and it made it kind of a special event. Also this week, we're going to take a trip in the Wayback Machine to an interview with Jeff Bezos in the Harvard Business Review 14 years ago. And it's kind of timely because Jeff has announced that he is going to step down as CEO on July 5th. I'll also have first impressions of the all-new Fire HD 10 tablet and the Finty keyboard that I bought. And that's going to be about it. We're going to talk a lot about that Bezos interview. And so, as my mother used to say, let's get this show on the road. I want to start talking about this interview with Jeff Bezos by mentioning how I came across it. I'm a beta tester for an app called Matter, and it's based here in Cambridge. I'll be talking to the founder, I think, in a few weeks. You can find it at getmatter.io, and that will get you an invitation to become a beta tester. I think because I'm in the beta test, I can get you into it quicker than if you just go to getmatter.io. So send me an email at podchronicles@gmail.com if you'd like to use one of my invites. What I love about this is it's a curated feed of articles that doesn't have anything to do with how recently they showed up. They're just chosen because they seem to be important, timely. They have all different kinds of sources. And this article, when I saw, interview with Jeff Bezos, Harvard Business Review, interesting. When was it? October of 2007. That was the month before the introduction of the Kindle. I thought, well, what would be the point of reading something that old about Jeff Bezos? But as it turns out, it's really an in-depth, probing, appreciative discussion with Bezos, all about strategy and how Amazon at that point was seeing its strategy and how Bezos was describing it. So they met. It was by two editors of the Harvard Business Review, Julia Kirby and Thomas A. Stewart, and they met with Jeff on two different occasions and then published kind of an edited version of the conversations. It begins with a review of Amazon's strategy-driven bold moves, which the authors describe as showing, quote, a knack for spotting white spaces and a willingness to jump into them, even as it works to make spaces it already occupies more productive. They then continue with a question that really does have resonance now as Bezos is about to step down, because they're talking about what is the company going to be like, essentially after Bezos. In 2007, the review wanted to look into what's different about strategy formulation at Amazon compared with other companies, and specifically, quote, how do ideas come under consideration and how are commitments made? Is it a matter of one ingredient, Jeff Bezos, or is it an institutional capability? That is the $1.6 trillion question at this point. That's Amazon's current market valuation. So the answer to that question does matter now, and I'll have a link to this article, which you might want to read if you like following the trajectory of Bezos and Amazon. You'll find that link at thekindlechronicles.com. And I'll also have a link there to the Matter.io link, and as I said, you can send me an email. So I went through this article very slowly, taking notes on my iPad this afternoon. It was really fun, just looking for things I hadn't known. One small thing, they talk about the team, S stands for senior. I didn't know that. And at the point when this interview was conducted, that met 4 hours every Tuesday. I wonder if that's still the case. And once or twice a year, they had a 2-day meeting. And they would choose things to make big bets on, things into the future. And also this kind of strategy focus, Bezos said, is happening at different levels of the company, not just the S team. It's all informed by a cultural point of view, which he elaborated. Some of it was pretty familiar, but one of them, I think it bears repeating, is the willingness to plant seeds and wait a long time for them to turn into trees. The authors had a question, do you know what seeds will turn into when you plant them? And Bezos answered, we may not know that it's going to turn into an oak, but at least we know that it can turn out to be that big. I think you need to make sure with things you choose that you are able to say, if we can get this to work, it will be big. An important question to ask is it big enough to be meaningful to the company as a whole if we're very successful? He said that as an empirical observation, as opposed to theorizing, he had discovered that when we plant a seed, it tends to take 5 to 7 years before it has a meaningful impact on the economics of the company. That probably fits with the Alexa introduction, because that was 7 years ago, November of 2014. Is it making a meaningful impact on Amazon? I think probably. Sales are clearly in the billions, and it's the market position of the Alexa devices in the smart speaker market is well over half, I'm sure of that. So he's saying you choose strategy based on what is not going to change in the next 5 or 10 years. He noted that many people come to him as kind of a technological visionary, saying, what's going to change? What's around the corner? And he said, a better question is what's not going to change? And, we've talked before about, he loves to say about customers, it's not likely that in 10 years they're going to say, Jeff, we wish you had less selection and higher prices, and that delivery was a little slower. No, those are three things which you can put long bets on if you are actually improving the ability to meet those unchanging requirements from the customer. It made me think of the new mission that Jeff introduced in the last shareholders letter, his last shareholders letter as CEO, in which he said that now having, I think, made a pretty good stab at becoming Earth's most customer-centric company, he now wants to be Earth's best employer. And if you were going to take a similar strategic thinking approach to that, I think most of us might be able to come up with what a customer wants, cheaper prices, faster delivery, more selection. But how about employees? If we were going to come up with as common sense an awareness of what are the things that employees want now and will probably want 5 or 10 years from now. This is just an experiment, but when I did it, I thought, well, I'm pretty sure they won't want lower wages. They won't want longer working hours. They won't want less input into working conditions, and they won't want fewer benefits. So there's 4 things that anything you could do to raise wages, reduce hours of the work week, and I think especially having input into working conditions, because that came up in that union election in Alabama. And the benefits, medical benefits from there on in. So when he picks one of these strategic goals at a high level and gives years to work on it, it's like a flywheel. And if you're putting energy into the right things which improve customer satisfaction or going forward, employee satisfaction, 10 years from now, it'll be spinning faster and faster. That's the flywheel that he talks about. There was a great line in here I hadn't seen before. He's talking about how in some ways it's simple to figure out what customers want and maybe what employees want. He says, no-brainers are no-brainers for a reason. They actually are important. You don't have to be clever to figure out some of these basic things which won't change. So there's also intriguing reference to the Amazon Marketplace, the third-party sellers, because it was fairly new at the time of this interview, and it has turned into a point of friction with regulators, Congress. Some of these sellers are coming forward and saying they feel like they're being treated unfairly by Amazon when ideas are used for Amazon to come up with its own branded products and different aspects of that. There wasn't any of that in the early days, and in fact, within the company, there was a lot of resistance to say, what? We're going to make our platform available to anybody, and if they have the same product at a lower price, we're going to give them the buy button. So it was a pretty radical idea when you see it from the beginning part. And Jeff, when he was taking that same kind of no-brainer approach to what do the sellers want on Amazon's marketplace, he says, as for the sellers, the number one thing that sellers want is sales. Maybe now there's something new to be added. They want to feel like they're on a fair platform when they choose to go in with Amazon. When he was talking to the interviewers about the third-party sellers, he said, we talked about that a lot before we did it. But when the intellectual conversation gets too hard because of these potential cannibalization issues, we take a simple-minded approach. There's an old Warren Buffett story that he has 3 boxes on his desk: inbox, outbox, and too hard. Whenever we're facing one of those too hard problems where we get into an infinite loop and can't decide what to do, we try to convert it into a straightforward problem by saying, well, what's better for the consumer? He said at one point, I think somehow I am congenitally consumer-focused. One advantage of being consumer-focused, he said in this article, is that their needs change slowly. So you have some time to catch up with them. This would be as opposed to if you're competitor-focused. If your competitor turns on a dime and you're trying to do a close follow, you've got to move pretty quickly as well. He said, years from now, when people look back at Amazon, I want them to say that we uplifted customer centricity across the entire business world. If we can do that, it will be really cool. 14 years after he said that, I think most of us would have a sense that Amazon's level of customer service has indeed spread. When you get somebody to answer the phone in less than a minute when you've got a problem with your Fire tablet, or you have all kinds of interactions with the company that turn out well. I have the experience of, then I have to do with LL Bean or something. And if they're not answering the phone right away, or they're not giving me that kind of customer-centric attitude, I really notice it. And I think there's pressure on other people to rise to that level. And now it does seem prevalent. When I need help from Apple, I call up and I get that same kind of instant, helpful attitude when I'm dealing with Apple. That's a similar company, but that'd be an interesting thing to measure. But I found it interesting that he would be saying not just that he wants Amazon to be the customer-centric company, but that the example of that would have a broader impact. And that's something that we've seen before when they went to the $15 wage. It wasn't just to help Amazon's workers and perhaps, be more competitive in the workplace. They enjoyed reports that showed that level of wage increase, so much higher than the minimum wage in most places, caused the wages to rise elsewhere, not just at Amazon. There was an interesting thing here, which I don't know if this is still true. If I have a chance to talk to somebody, I'll ask. He said every new employee, no matter how senior or junior, has to spend time in our fulfillment centers within the first year of employment. Every 2 years, they do 2 days of customer service. Everyone has to be able to work in a call center. And the HBR editor said, well, how about you? And he said, yep, I have, recertified within the last 6 months. And but boy, when you get 1 million employees, are they still doing that? I guess I would be surprised if that was the case. When they were pressing him on how do you come up with ideas and strategies that succeed, he said that you have to maximize the number of experiments you can do per given unit of time. So there's a very kind of a metric-driven sense of doing experiments to test things so that you can get the information quickly. This is what I hadn't seen before, too. He gave an example of an idea that did not work out. He said, we launched a feature, I forget what we named it, where we take your purchase history and then find out of the millions of other customers, the one customer whose purchase history was the closest match. You could push a button and we'd show you all the things that your doppelganger had bought that you had not. No one used it. That reminds me of the story that's gotten a lot of notoriety from Brad Stone's book about the single cow burger, which I guess was something Bezos thought was cool, and it's, I guess that's not a big hit either. But when you test things like that, you find out. At the same time, there are some initiatives where you can't just put a toe in the water. You have to go all in. And Jeff said, and by the way, it's very fun to have that kind of culture where people are willing to take these leaps. It's the opposite of the institutional no. It's the institutional yes. People say, we're going to do this. We're going to figure out a way. And that institutional yes was picked up in the title of this article in the Harvard Business Review. I think I mentioned after the Brad Stone interview that the question of whether Bezos has changed since the last Brad Stone book, 11 years, that somehow he's become a master of the universe and he's not the same person that we're hearing in this interview 14 years ago. I guess I doubt it. I think one way that you could find out if you had access to Jeff, which Brad did not for this book, is he having as much fun as he described in these days. And I think there's evidence for it. He sort of skips his way to work or whistles while he's on the way to work, and the almost boyish joy that he gets out of doing this kind of work. Maybe he's bored with it, but I doubt it. I think that these kinds of challenges, they go all the way back to his boyhood, working on the ranch, that these kinds of things which ring his bell, I would be surprised if they change just because he's become the richest man in the world. But yeah, you never know. We learned in this interview that he's very detail-oriented. As an example, he learned the Six Sigma and lean manufacturing approaches in order to dive deep on defect reduction, which was something that he knew was a very important part of Amazon succeeding in the whole fulfillment center process, and that if you make improvements in that kind of a thing, they have a big impact on earnings 10 years down the road. One example is they were measuring the number of customer contacts per unit sold, and at the time of this interview, that number had gone down every year for 12 years. And the reason that's a good one to watch is that our customers don't contact us unless something's wrong, so we want that number to move down. Toward the end of the interview, the authors asked Jeff a question that gave him a chance to reflect on his personal odyssey as a company founder. They said, what else has been critical to your ability to grow as a manager and leader? Often entrepreneurs aren't able to scale with the businesses they found. And Jeff replied, I don't know that I have anything profound to say about that. When you start out, it's a one-person thing, at least on the first day. And you're not only figuring out what to do, but actually doing it. That's him, taking boxes to the post office. At a certain point, the company gets bigger, and you get to where you're mostly figuring out what to do, but not how it's done. Eventually, you get to the point where you're mostly figuring out who's going to do it, not even what to do. So one way to think about this is as a transition of questions from how to what to who. It's not necessarily a conscious thing. Circumstances dictate it. As things get bigger, I don't think you can operate any other way. So the question for any senior executive is basically, are you progressing along that curve at the right rate? And then he adds, now, of course, I'm oversimplifying because the reality is that you continue to dive in deep in selected areas. I've never met what I think of as a good executive who does not choose certain highly leveraged activities, some area they consider so important that they will inspect it all the way down to the how stage. I think that was evident when Jeff went all into the details on Amazon's COVID response, that he all of a sudden was the hands-on executive of old, and that I think that probably paid off in Amazon's ability to operate in that extremely difficult period. So, excellent interview. I'll have a link in the show notes, and I learned a lot reading it. I was glad that the Matter app pointed me to it. Second, kind of a related news article in Current Time, Al Dimmitt sent me a link to an Economist piece from the Schumpeter column, Amazon's feature beyond Jeff Bezos. It opens with a appreciative nod to Amazon Unbound, Brad Stone's book, and it also refers to Bezos as, quote, arguably the world's most accomplished businessman, coming from The Economist. I think that's noteworthy. And they note that Amazon's revenues have grown at a compound annual rate of more than 40% every year for more than 2 decades. But they also have information from an Edinburgh-based asset manager in Scotland, Bailey Gifford, saying that they have cut into their Amazon stake after 15 years as a shareholder, and they recently told their investors it no longer has a founder CEO, talking of Amazon. We fear that in his inimitable terms, it is no longer day one in Seattle, though the road ahead is still long and profitable. The Economist cites Brad's book on Bezos's omnipotence within the firm. He's a master of in-house invention, obsession with high standards, very deeply involved in things like the starting of Alexa. And the question is, does Andy Jassy lack the founder's inventive streak, and therefore is the success really going to be able to continue? And the Economist asks, even before Jeff announced that he was leaving as CEO on July 5th, has he really been playing the same role as he was in the earlier period? Because Brad Stone's book suggests a metamorphosis away from that kind of detail orientation and the kinds of involvement with the company which led to its success. And now he's master of the universe. He's building a super yacht. He's focused on space and the Washington Post and Hollywood and his new romance. And so The Economist takes those elements of the book and says, in short, he appeared to have outgrown his terrestrial creation. But they also say that this MGM acquisition, which was announced 2 days ago, could be a new flywheel, blockbuster entertainment, feeding advertising, feeding shopping, going round and round, reinforcing each other. In that sense, it could have been, Jeff's final genius, bold initiative. Yeah, there's the great-grandfather's clock. We haven't heard that in a while. I got the gong fixed, so it's not quite so rattly. Nice. Economist is saying, okay, the MGM thing might just be the next Kindle, the next Alexa. And in these murky beginnings, it's not obvious how successful something might be. But it could be the departing CEO's final vanity project, a worrying sign of hubris. And then they end with a kind of literary flourish. It opens up referring to the fact that MGM has part of the ownership of the James Bond series. And then there's a reference to Ernst Stavro Blofeld. I looked this up on Wikipedia to get the reference because there was a reference to stroking a white cat. And The Economist says, if the MGM acquisition is a sign of hubris, quote, it would be more worrying, suggesting that Mr. Bezos will use his new role as executive chairman to drive Amazon from the leather-clad luxury of the back seat, perhaps stroking a white cat as he does so. Well, in another 14 years, if I'm still talking to you about this, we might be able to look back and say, yeah, I remember we were wondering if Bezos was just going to become the guy in the back seat stroking the cat and palling around in Hollywood instead of that being, the brilliant thing which he set in motion back in 2021. Lots to follow. There are other big stories that I thought, gee whiz, I could talk all day about the news, but we've got a promising breakthrough in e-ink technology. The District of Columbia Attorney General has sued Amazon in an antitrust case that looks like it could have quite some significance. And Amazon was reported to be considering brick-and-mortar pharmacies. And I've got links to all those stories in the show notes at thekindlechronicles.com. For the tech tip, I want to give you my first impressions of the all-new Fire HD 10. I bought one, the 32-gigabyte model, $150 and a nice big tablet. I also spent $50 getting the Finty Bluetooth keyboard. So in some ways, this is like my iPad Pro with the Magic Keyboard, but that costs hundreds of dollars more, of course, and it has a pencil, and it's a completely higher level of technology. But this $200 package it's well done. The screen is bright. It's a convenient weight. I get the lavender color to it, so it's pretty flashy. It's going to be a great tablet to play games on with my grandsons Ryan and Jake, and I can throw it in the car when I'm going there. Or if we're biking out to their house, just have this handy little tablet to be playing games with. The keyboard has pretty good action. It's a Bluetooth keyboard, and it's keyed up with the Fire tablet, so if you press the home button, it goes to home, and it has pretty much a quality feel. Heavier than the iPad, and there's no trackpad. You don't have that, which you have in the Magic Keyboard. But gee whiz, for the price, it's a pretty fine looking tablet, and at the least, I'm going to enjoy watching some movies on it and exploring it a little bit more, finding out what it can do. It does have the Microsoft 365 service, so if I could be moving things around in Word documents and other things onto the tablet and my Macintosh, so that's a benefit. Well, I'm excited to share this week's interview with you with Paul Rudnick, author of Playing the Palace, a romance novel released by Penguin Random House on Tuesday, May 25th. That was the day of our conversation. As I said, Darlene joined me for the interview, which I think is a first of 12 years doing the show, and it was great to have her at the microphone with me when we spoke with Paul at his home in, I think, New Jersey, maybe it was New York, via Zoom. I'm sorry to report that the first 5 minutes or so are missing because I neglected to click on the Zoom button as we started. But for a lucky glance at the bottom of my monitor, I might have missed the entire interview. But luckily, I clicked record in time to get the remaining 22 minutes. So I'm very grateful about that. Grateful to the podcasting gods for a fairly quick recovery. The missing opening minutes included Paul's telling of how he sometimes seeks refuge in St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan because of the soaring space and the level of comfort he feels there. He confessed that he imagines living in a space like that, that's that grand, and even to the point of looking around and seeing where he might hang his flat-screen TV. He also gave a quick summary of the story, which is about a gay Jewish event planner from New Jersey named Carter Ogden, who falls in love with the openly gay future King of England, Prince Edgar. As I clicked the record button finally, Paul was in the middle of describing his reaction to Oprah's television interview with the real Prince, Prince Harry, and Meghan Markle. That was in early March. Now, by that time, he'd finished the book. It had been edited. He wasn't able to use anything from that interview to inform his portrayal of what it's like to fall in love with a royal. But he did have these interesting comments and then went on from there.
Yeah, I thought I'll watch this for 5 minutes and then turn it off. Of course, I was completely consumed with it. And I felt that I got certain things right. So, and I thought, of course, in my insane writer brain, I thought, I want this book to be poking out of Megan's tote bag at the beach. So I want to hear from them. I want to say, okay, you got this right, this not so much. But yeah, I think it reflected the idea of what a complicated life that would be, when you're on the palace grounds, when you're also half American, and also I think, Megan has experienced such prejudice for her biracial background, and she's handled it with such grace and such intelligence that you think, okay, how would two gay guys make their way through what would, I assume, be great obstacles? But on the other hand, I didn't want to create a book that was about coming out or about trauma. I wanted to say, no, this is possible. This is joyous. This also could be welcomed. The way I think America seems to adore Harry and Meghan. Sometimes we love the royals more than England does. England can be much tougher on them. But the whole world is a tabloid when royals start falling in love.
Yeah, there's a line in there about when Carter starts understanding that kind of scrutiny. He wonders how anybody in the royal family could even get out of bed in the morning, because your whole day is just subject to an excruciating level of scrutiny.
Yeah, that's also why I think Carter ends up being a very good influence on Prince Edgar. Kind of the way Meghan is on Harry, that sense of, okay, somebody, a breath of fresh air, someone who says, maybe we can rewrite this rule book, at least to a certain extent. Maybe if we're honest with the world, that will be returned in kind. So I think Carter is somebody who says, all right, I'll use, oddly, his whole background in party planning, in dealing with people, in figuring out how a wedding, a bat mitzvah, a bridal shower, a gender reveal party, that all becomes oddly a useful skill set for becoming a royal. And ultimately, it makes him invaluable. I mean, these two guys are in love, but it's also a good match. You think, okay, that's somebody who could actually help. That's somebody who could, you've watched the royal family, I think, especially since the death of Princess Diana, become more open and allow far more access. It was very rare to have any public interview until these past few years. And it's why I so admire Harry for talking about mental health issues that he's dealt with personally. And I think Carter's the kind of guy who would tell Prince Edgar, yeah, trust people, talk about your life, talk about our lives. And I think that it's a fairy tale that everyone can share.
Yeah, I think in my telling of it, and when I was reading it aloud to Darlene, there were times I was getting emotional and I had to pretend like it wasn't affecting me, and I would just sort of pause and have some water. But, it really touched me at times of when they're trying to trust each other, when they're just, the whole prospect of them having a relationship that works just seems impossible. It almost seems like anybody in a relationship in love might find themselves feeling more like one than the other. And I know you're in a long-term partnership. Are you Edgar, or are you Carter in your relationship?
I would be far more the Carter because I mess up far more frequently than John, my partner. And John is a doctor, which is,
he better not mess up.
Exactly, and a source of, endless free medical advice. Also, I found that was when I first met John. I called my mother and I said, I met this most wonderful man. And she was thrilled, of course. And then I said, and he's a doctor. And the quelling that, my mom was a wonderful and deeply accomplished Jewish woman. And then she took another pause and she said, is he Jewish? And I said, no, actually, he's not. And then she took another pause and she said, is he smart? I thought, oh my God, that's appalling. I almost hung up on her. She really, that was how her brain worked. Then once they met, they totally, went wild for each other. And when my mom actually was no longer with us, and when she became quite ill, what she would do when she would go see her regular doctor, she would bring my cousin Carl, who's also a doctor, and John, my doctor boyfriend. So it was like this armada, and I felt so bad for her regular doctor that she was bringing these reinforcements. But she was just in her glory. She was just the queen of the medical profession. So when she and John, of course, had immediately sort of formed a militia against me. You know how your spouse always, there are lots of whispered conversations in the corner. But John is extraordinary. So it's... he's tougher than I am, and he can keep me in line in certain very helpful ways where you want someone, especially if you live in a world of show business, you want somebody to say, get over yourself. That's not the real world. And he's been, invaluable with that. And also with saying, when you have a rash on your arm and you say, what is this? Does this look, am I dying?
That's helpful.
That is very helpful to have somebody say, no, that's a mosquito bite.
You're right.
But he certainly is plays much more the Edgar role. I think, and I like to think that I've loosened him up a bit too, because I've introduced him to theater people and movie people, many of whom he now adores and many of whom he thinks are completely insane. All of whom have asked him for free medical advice and often for prescriptions.
Why not?
Exactly. That's the real danger. When I first would introduce him to my friends, when we first met, and they would say, "Oh, can you get us, Valium? Can you get us Xanax?" And I said, "You don't get to ask those questions. I'm not your doctor." And he's been very gracious about dealing with those particular requests and fending them off most of the time. So, I think every couple figures out their balance the way Carter and Edgar are, because, they each have something of use for the other.
Right. The other character that's so riveting is Queen Catherine. And I don't want to give away any of the plot items, but were you conscious of modeling Queen Catherine on Queen Elizabeth II, or in what ways are they different, or are they the same? Is there any kind of relationship between those two, your queen and the real queen?
Well, I borrowed elements because I've always been so impressed with Queen Elizabeth. I think she has behaved impeccably for so many decades, and she doesn't complain. She doesn't, at least in public, ever feel sorry for herself. Sometimes she's been accused of being a little chilly, but she certainly has made inroads over the years, to be more open and more accessible to the public. But you think, okay, that is someone who doesn't play a lot of these sort of whiny games that certainly a lot of our politicians are after. So I took a lot from her strength. I also love the idea of imagining an inner life for her and picturing her kind of enjoying her power. That I think when you see, I remember the photos of her when she sort of avoided having the Trumps to Buckingham Palace for a while, and suddenly they all showed up looking like, this sort of garish family of steakhouse owners. And there's Queen Elizabeth, who's being incredibly gracious and polite. And you could see this is perhaps not her favorite moment during her many years on the throne. So I love the sense of that she does her job perfectly, but she also is no one's fool. So I used a lot of that for Queen Catherine. And I love the idea that she is aware of how the air changes when she enters the room. So, and when Carter first meets her, I think he had hoped that introduction would take place under ideal circumstances. He'd be perfectly dressed, he'd be articulate, he'd be an ideal representative of American life. And of course, it's 2 a.m. in the palace kitchen when he's stealing a snack. And so there's Queen Catherine in her bathrobe, and she's, crackers are spewing out of his mouth, and just not the way he thought this would go. And I think she relishes that sort of challenge, that moment of, okay, I can make this kid crawl. But what you also find out is she's not without heart, that she really cares most deeply about her grandson and about his emotional life. And he's had a tough time of it early on. So that's what she wants. She wants to make sure her son has found the exact right guy. I didn't want to write a story about coming out or about trauma or even particularly about prejudice, but more about romance in any family, but in a family with enormous power and a family with a certain influence in the world who know, okay, if this is the right guy, then we're all in. If it's not, we're going to use our entire arsenal to break this off. So Carter is, he's up against the Queen of England. It's one of those odd things where you also think, when you use those tropes like, well, who do you think you are, the Queen of England? What if she is? It's like saying, well, it's not rocket science. What if you're talking to a rocket scientist? So that it was very particular challenges. I think even with Carter, when he's first going out with the prince and has to wonder, do I call you Your Highness in bed? But at one point, his roommates sort of create a gift basket filled with things like Royal Crown Cola. So that everyone has fun with the idea of, wait, we're Americans, so we're not technically beholden to the crown. We did break away. There was a Revolutionary War, but they still have a certain hold over us. Yeah. So that was where the book came from. I thought that's a fun tension, especially with a romance at the center of it.
Well, when Carter's going up against the Queen of England, he has a kind of an imagined resource in Ruth Ginsburg. That's an interesting, because she occurs a lot through the story. Talk about that. Why is Ruth Ginsburg in this book?
Well, I've always revered Ruth Ginsburg. I think she was a genuine moral force. She was someone who worked so hard against insane obstacles, but also enjoyed herself. I love that Ruth Ginsburg was a big fan of the theater and the opera, that she wasn't just, there was nothing grim about her. And she was implacable. It's why I thought, she and Queen Elizabeth might understand each other. And why Carter looks to her as kind of a touchstone, a sense of, okay, what would Ruth Bader Ginsburg do? I had a friend, a brilliant artist named Kim Constance Beatty, who did an oil portrait of Ruth Bader Ginsburg from life. And it's just glorious. And she told me that meeting her was everything you would dream of, that she was that impressive and that warm and that welcoming. And so I thought, that's who Carter looks to when he has to make the biggest possible decisions. And he also somehow relates Ruth Ginsburg to his Aunt Miriam as being a tough Jewish woman who won't let him get away with anything. So that photo of Ruth is always up on his wall, and it's, it keeps him on the right path.
Carter imagines Ruth saying, you've got a date with a prince. Stop being you and just be yourself. And that's sort of a philosophical distinction there. What's the difference between you and yourself when you have a date with a prince?
Oh, exactly. Well, it's the difference between the anxious, paranoid, hopeless you and your better self. And I think there's that moment that it's sort of like that moment in Moonstruck when Cher slaps Nicolas Cage and says, snap out of it. That's part of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg function in playing the Palace, that it's a way of saying, no, stop obsessing, stop throwing obstacles in your own path, stop self-sabotaging, get on with it. You're better than this. I know you're better than this. And that's what she means. Because it's that weird thing, which I remember from when I was very little, when people would say, just be yourself, I thought, that could be a recipe for disaster. Because maybe I shouldn't be all of myself all the time. There's that somehow always sounds like a dream therapy goal. And no, I think people are more complicated than that. And we do need to get over ourselves. So that's what Carter ultimately achieves. And I think when he's around Edgar, he doesn't ever lie. He doesn't dissemble. He doesn't feel he has to become someone else entirely. But Edgar kind of opens up his thinking about what he's capable of and why he should sometimes just stop with, the sort of emotional OCD all the time of thinking of the 83 ways that any given situation could go badly.
Only 83?
I was being generous, kind. Well, it's also from my Jewish family, there was always the Kinahara poo syndrome, which is whenever anything good happens, you mime spitting on the floor to keep the evil eye away. And I realized I was raised with that. There's always sort of a dark cloud behind every silver lining. It can drive you crazy. Yeah. So I think Carter has to deal with, be sensible, be aware, but don't always assume the worst. Sometimes life works out.
Sometimes.
There you go. See, there. Now you're going to be Exhibit A in my trial.
Yeah. No, I think it's. I found it inspiring that way. And Darlene, when I asked if she would join me, she said, "You're always putting your life out in public." I've got this tiny little podcast. To her that's like being a royal, spilling your guts everywhere. But at 37 years married, there's what's next? Where do you go? And just the stress of the changes these two characters have to put on themselves in order to even have a chance at the relationship, it makes me think about things and say, well, I don't do that, and Edgerly never does that, all this sort of ridiculous narrative that I carry into the relationship with her, and the story perhaps because we read it aloud, it's a more intimate experience of it. The story kind of shook me up in a good way, and she won probably 60% more disagreements that we had in the process of reading your book, just because I'm thinking, well, Carter ought to be flexible. Maybe I should be more flexible. I don't know. It's like it had that effect. I don't know if that's what you were going for, but at least it happened to us.
Oh, I love that. No, I think it's part of why romance will always be with us, that we all like to not necessarily compare our own relationships, but use them, but contrast them and figure out, okay, what can I take from this other couple? How do I resemble them? How can we move forwards? Maybe there'll be some tips here. Because, as you guys clearly know, it's trial and error. And that's what Carter and Edgar at the very beginning of their life together, but they're learning, and you figure out, especially those moments where hope seems lost, and you realize not necessarily. That it's, there's no bigger challenge than staying together. That's why I admire the two of you, my Lord, but how great. And that's, I think, what Carter and Edgar are aiming for is, okay, we're in this for keeps.
Yeah, exactly. So now that we're talking, we have a microphone, we have somebody. How did the book affect your view of our marriage?
I love a good romance, and it was just the characters were so wonderful. You every character you were just enthralled with, and that isn't always the case. So I don't know. I love it. I wish there were like 10 more.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, that is what I live for. So I'll see what I can do.
Okay. I'm going to hold you to that.
All right, give me a day or so.
Well, let's see. Do you have a hard stop coming up in about 5 minutes, or what's next?
I think so. Yeah, I think I've got
okay.
it.
All right. Well, if this were to be a movie or a play, which do you think it would be most suitable for, since you've had experiences with both?
Yeah, it's funny because I had thought about early on when I was first, sort of playing around with this material. I wondered where it should land, and it's possible as either a book or a screenplay. But as a novel, I could get inside Carter's head in a way that's only possible on the page, and I could create his voice, because I thought this is a guy who's dealing with this unimaginably powerful and appealing and terrifying world. And I want to be with him every second to trace his reactions. But I think there's a way in which it could also certainly work on screen, because you'd have the pleasure of those locations of suddenly, oh, that's a palace, that's a fifth floor walk up. So it's a different kind of joy, but it could translate. So I'd be happy to have it anywhere else. But I especially love it as a book, just because it feels like, you're really right with that couple every second.
Well, when I read Darlene the first few paragraphs of the book, that's when she decided more. I want more. Any chance? Have you got the book with you? Could you read just like the first 3 paragraphs of the book for my listeners? Or
if you give me a moment, I have. Sure. I should have had it right next to me, but I will go ahead. This is why it's good to wear pants when you're on Zoom.
Good. Well, I wasn't recording the first 5 or 10 minutes, but
I was afraid of that.
Yeah.
Okie doke, here we go. It's still weird waking up alone. I was with Callum for almost 3 years, and he moved out 6 months ago. But this morning, when I opened my eyes, for a second, I thought he was just out of town on an acting job, and maybe I'd have a text waiting. But of course not. Instead, I stayed under the covers and addressed my problems to the framed photo of the late beloved Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the wall of my tiny partition bedroom. Ruth keeps me on a firm, morally responsible track, and I like to think that she secretly enjoyed watching Callum and me having sex. In all matters, except maybe wardrobe, I always ask myself, what would Ruth Ginsburg do? So today I wondered if I was ever going to fall in love again, truly in love this time, and Ruth informed me, stop whining and go to work, you little pisher. I'm in heaven, but I'm still busy. Ruth often sounds like my equally beloved 85-year-old great-aunt Miriam. I took a shower using my new Manly body wash, which is exactly the same as the female version, only with simplified graphics and a steel gray squared off bottle, as if it contains motor oil and testosterone. I slathered on Kiehl's Creme de Corps moisturizer because a model at my gym recommended it after he glanced at my pores with pity, but then insisted, no, they're fine. Really, you just need to think about them. I brushed my teeth with a gel that promised triple extreme dazzling whiteness, thanks to Jean Spliced Wintergreen, and then I got busy with more hair care products than a Mormon family has children. I was pampering myself as a fan of what the mindfulness tutorials call self-care in order to heal and glow. But after a final check in the mirror, I knew none of it was working. I wasn't healed and I wasn't glowing, and a sizable chunk of my hair was completely awry, as if signaling frantically for help. So, asked my roommate Adam, once I'd reached the kitchen area of our shared, let's call it a 3-bedroom in the budget-friendly wilds of Hell's Kitchen, Adam's a Broadway dancer, which means that just seeing him both cheered me up and sent me into a body image spiral, because he's got the lithe muscles you only achieve from doing cardio for a living. He was wearing the limp, colorless, shredded sweats that dancers barely cover themselves with. Are you feeling any better? He offered me a smoothie he'd concocted. He meant well, but I shook my head no as I plunged my hand into a box of Frosted Flakes, which made Adam look Whole Foods judgmental and also heartbroken on my behalf. I studied Tony the Tiger on the cereal box and wondered if he'd ever been cheated on, maybe by the Lucky Charms leprechaun or Captain Crunch.
That's wonderful.
There you go. Oh, thank you.
I have been speaking with Paul Rudnick, author of Playing the Palace, his new novel released today by Berkeley, an imprint of Penguin Random House. Thanks very much, Paul. Good luck with the book.
Oh, thank both of you so much for having me.
Take care.
Take care.
That's it for this week. My guest next week is going to be Lisa Unger, author of a new Amazon Original Stories 4-part series titled House of Crows. It was released yesterday, May 27th. It's about a girl who walked into the woods and vanished forever. It's a never-forgotten mystery that clings like a shadow, and a short story about dark memories and inescapable fears. Pretty good read. I've through the first of the 4 parts of it, and I'm going to enjoy it. We got some news today from Tesla that the new Model Y that we ordered is going to be delivered sometime between tomorrow, and Tuesday, so just in the next 3 or 4 days. In Peabody, Massachusetts. That's pretty exciting. This really has crystallized the search for a name. It's a Model Y, and it's blue. So I came up with the possibility of calling it Yoshi, which is Ryan's favorite character when we're playing Mario Kart 8, the racing game. And he can choose Yoshi, and then he usually chooses blue Yoshi. So I think we may be onto something. But Darlene says, ask your podcast listeners if anybody has an idea of a really clever name. We named the first one, the Model 3, simply Tess, after months of going back and forth on names. And at this point, the name to beat is Yoshi for the Model Y. And it's going to be great to be picking that up and trying it out within the next couple of days. I hope you'll consider joining me for the Clubhouse conversation. Those are just turning out to be great weekly events. I thought about doing it on Tuesday because of the holiday, but I think I'll stick with Monday at 1 p.m. There may be some of you that aren't able to come to something during the week that on the holiday you'll be able to come. I'm thinking Peggy and some of the others. But that'll be Monday, 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time at Clubhouse, and there'll be a link to it in the show notes. So we've had some good conversations, and we'll be talking about the interview and anything else that's on your mind. Thanks a lot for listening. Have a good week.